let you go.
So thanks for being with us today, everybody, for our Friday Five Live conversation. And if you have any questions or comments that come up during the session, you can just use the chat feature. And if you're comfortable sharing your messages with everybody, if you could please select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down box there. It's right next to the word "to." And everybody will have access to the recording next week. If you're a GoToKnowledge member, the recording will be on your dashboard, and otherwise we will email it to you. And our host today is Meg Foster. Meg has spent 20 years in higher education focused on student success initiatives and working in areas such as orientation, faculty development, online learning, student leadership, and first-year initiatives. And Meg, I will pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Melissa. It's always so fun getting to kick off these conversations with Melissa and her insights as a mom of three with two graduate student and college student. And we're lucky to have Jean Mandernach back with us today. Jean, thank you so much for the gift of your time and your insights. Jean is at Grand Canyon University, where she's about to drive at the end of next month, her oldest child, in a VW Bug with approximately 1,000 square feet worth of apartment items to start a college career there, which is very exciting. But when she's not parenting 4 kids, Jean Mandernach is the research professor and executive director of the Center for Innovation and Research and Teaching at Grand Canyon University. And you just have such amazing and important insights, I think, into what is going on in our virtual classrooms, what is going on in our face-to-face classrooms. And I'm really excited today to get to continue our conversation. On the 16th of July, we started talking about what we can do to address this idea you shared with us of the COVID crash, which was, I think, a term the Chronicle of Higher Ed kind of spit out earlier this month. And lots of research I'm seeing, you were sharing concerns about the research indicating our white affluent students being 4 to 6 months behind where they would normally be. Our students of color, our low socioeconomic students being 8 to 12 months behind. And the New York Times actually just yesterday, I think, had additional data backing up that. So I think those are important things to consider as we move into this, what will promise to be an unusual academic year. Thinking about it kind of as a bridge year between a year of pandemic learning and then a year of what kind of comes next. So thanks, Jean, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to continue our conversation.
Yeah, and you've done some really interesting research. I think I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit in my questions. I hope that's okay. All right. And you've conducted some research this year with faculty and their kinds of, I think, some concerns about shifts in student expectations. I was just thinking about this today as I'm going to have a conversation in a little bit with my supervisor at the community college and thinking about how am I going to provide academic coaching right in this fall semester. And I'm thinking about the number of students. Everybody I saw last year was all virtual, and I think students aren't going to want to let go of that flexibility, that they may not want to come to campus for resources and services. So would love to hear just kind of from you, what are you hearing from your faculty about concerns that they might be having or areas of things they're excited about, but just if they're seeing shifts in kind of what students are expecting in the academic experience.
Yeah, as you can imagine, we are, and we're seeing shifts in things that we haven't really contemplated before. So I can't even say that there's shifts for good or for evil, but unanticipated. And I think the big question on everyone's mind was, are students going to come back to campus, or are they going to be so excited about the new flexibility and the freedom and being able to do everything on their own schedule that what we thought of as the face-to-face classroom is no longer going to exist? And the good news is all of the data, and I'm saying literally all of it, shows us they're coming back. Now, interestingly, in that though, their motivations for coming back are not strongly tied to teaching and learning. They're coming back because they miss the campus experience, and they miss being around people, and they miss connecting with people, and they miss that really holistic vision of what college means. Mm-hmm. So they are undoubtedly coming back. but they're coming back with some really different expectations. And I think this is where, as faculty, we're going to have to just kind of really rethink what our expectations are. Because historically, higher ed has really had a fairly faculty-centric model. Faculty would say when they were available, and it was up to the students to adjust their schedules to make that work. Faculty would schedule a class, and students either could make it or they couldn't make it. But it was really more about the schedule and what the faculty member had available and what the faculty member could offer. And what we're seeing is the pandemic has completely shifted our philosophy of teaching and learning. So if we think back to 18 months ago, when all the emergency remote teaching just kicked off, really that shift was all about mimicking face-to-face online. So everybody grabbed Zoom and Google Meet and everything else, and we started giving what we would have done in class. So whatever lecture we had planned, we now just delivered it remotely. And we did that for just a few months, surviving the emergency remote teaching. So no criticism there. Everybody was in survival mode. But after a couple of months, everyone was disappointed. Faculty were frustrated that students weren't engaged. Students were frustrated that it felt like a waste of time. Everybody was just feeling like they weren't getting the educational experience they had signed up for. And then we saw a surge of editorials and opinion pieces where parents were questioning whether they should have to pay as much, and all of this kind of general dissatisfaction. And the challenge was everybody said, oh, we're dissatisfied with online learning. And I was like, oh gosh, don't say that, because you're not actually engaging in online learning. You're engaging in emergency remote teaching. And as all emergency situations are, it wasn't perfect. It was a Band-Aid. It was an effective Band-Aid that got us through the emergency. But within just a couple of months, everyone, students, teachers, parents, everyone started to shift, and they quit saying, how do I mimic what I did face-to-face? And they started asking, what am I trying to accomplish? And how do I best accomplish that with what I have available to me? And what we saw lecturing via Zoom decrease. We saw faculty really questioning, how do I get students involved? Now, one of the first, how do I get students involved, was answered by have them turn their cameras on, and we're going to make sure we can see them involved. Well, just as our off-the-cuff quick shift to emergency remote teaching kind of crashed and burned, so did this push that somehow, if we could see students, that meant they were engaged. And we debated that for a couple months, and but what came from that debate was this deeper understanding of what is active learning? What does it mean if students are engaged? Let's face it, just because they're looking at us doesn't mean they're thinking, doesn't mean they're paying attention, doesn't mean they're processing that information. And so we let go of that debate about cameras. We let go of our desire to mimic what was happening face-to-face, and we started asking the hard questions. And as we moved in, even 1 year ago, so even moving into last fall, we started asking, what am I trying to accomplish? How will I know if I got there? And when we started asking those deeper pedagogical questions, we shifted away from technology. We shifted away from how do I mimic what I did face-to-face? And we started to dig deep and ask, what is teaching? Is teaching content delivery? Is teaching building relationships? Is teaching facilitating and guiding a learning experience? And really, to what extent is teaching a little bit of every one of those pieces? And if it is, how do we best do that in whatever mode we have available to us? And I think that fundamental shift is something we're never going to be able to come back from. Once we've questioned, was I really teaching before? I mean, I was giving lectures. I was present in front of the classroom. They were taking notes. But now we're questioning, were they really learning? Was I really adding value to anything that they had done? When we started to rethink that teaching and learning, I think a lot of people realized, what I was doing before wasn't good teaching either. I just had never questioned it. I had never thought about it because that's just what I've always done. And now that we've dabbled in the deeper questions, I don't know that we can ever go back to the idea that students are just responsive to us.
Mm-hmm.
So even on a very concrete level, office hours. I don't know that we will ever again see traditional office hours. We have decades of research that tells us students that attend office hours are more engaged and they're more satisfied, they learn more, they're more connected to the institution, all this really good data. We have a larger pile of data that says, despite this knowledge, students do not attend office hours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And pretty much every faculty we talk to says, yeah, I just sit in my office hours alone because no one ever shows up. Well, the pandemic hit, we could no longer sit in our office. And we started realizing, I could just give them a Zoom link and I can sit here and they can sit there and we can meet for 3 minutes and not deal with parking and scheduling and walking in and investing an hour of our day for a 5-minute conversation. We can literally just invest 5 minutes and accomplish what we need.
Mm-hmm.
We realized quickly that students were less intimidated to meet with us one-on-one remotely than they were face-to-face. So students were more willing to engage in virtual office hours. My prediction is we won't really see traditional office hours come back because the virtual ones were more effective, more engaging, and more useful for both faculty and students.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's just a really concrete example of this philosophical shift when we started asking what was important. What was important is that we could have one-on-one connection, that we could answer questions, that we could meet individual needs. What was not important was that happened in my office at my schedule.
Right.
And so we started letting go of some of those things. And I don't see that coming back.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can I give you a flip side right quick and then I'll let you hop in though. The flip side of that, and this is the one that faculty have really complained about this summer. And I'm not sure where we're going to see this one go, to be honest with you. The flip side is we also have set up an expectation that students can shoot an email that says, I'm not going to be in class today. Let me know where the Zoom link is. Let me know when I can watch it. Let me know when I can catch up. And faculty are like, wait a minute. There is value in coming. There is value in what I have to offer. And if we're designing learning experiences around a synchronous or a face-to-face interaction, watching that as a passive outsider is not the same as participating in it. And so I think students kind of like, hey, I can just Zoom in or I can watch the recording is going to be a challenge as instructors embrace that philosophy of a more engaged learning experience. And so I think that we're going to see some struggle there between student expectations and faculty expectations.
I've seen much and heard much the same from colleagues who are, and I think it's going to be challenging too as we continue forward. Summer enrollments traditionally are not high enrollment numbers, right? And unfortunately, there's this Delta variant, and right. So how are we going to come back in the fall and address well, I actually have to quarantine for 2 weeks. Right. And I mean, we've all had the students who, the 14 grandmothers died during the course of the semester. I mean, we've all taught those folks, and it is going to be, in addition to this philosophical shift, which I very much see, Jean, I think there's also going to be the continued added struggle of, the pandemic isn't really over yet. There's, unfortunately, right?
Well, and as we talk about, the philosophical shift to teaching and learning, I think a related shift that happened was really faculty finally, and I say this as a faculty member, finally appreciating students' personal lives and experiences that were happening outside of the classroom. Prior to the pandemic, we really would kind of be like, your responsibility to get the notes, your responsibility to catch up. I wrote my policies in the syllabus. That it is what it is. And we really became much more empathic. We became much more flexible. And I think faculty are going to struggle a bit, not because we should be less empathic and less flexible, but because at some point when there's one of us and 25, 50, 75, 100 of them, you almost hit like empathy fatigue. I can't continue to adjust everything and be flexible to every student, every learner, every need, particularly when we have that little handful of the 14 dying grandmothers and the third time I got COVID this semester, and like the things that were like, I'm not really sure that you're now needing valid empathy and flexibility. And so I think professors are going to really feel this struggle between, I now am more empathic. I have tried to embrace a more flexible approach to the teaching and learning, but I have capacity limits for how much I can adapt to everyone, and finding that balance without really just emotionally tapping themselves out, trying to be accommodating and yet having to have a realistic work-life balance.
Right. And I would also say, as a student services professional, that those of you who are on our call today, I think you feel the same way. I mean, having served as an academic coach last year, it was hard not to be available at all times because I was so concerned about my students. But that was also not healthy for the 3 kids that are in my house, right? So how do we find those balances? And it's beautiful to see, so much of the positive feedback, I think, as we're making these kinds of philosophical shifts. I've seen in one of our earlier episodes this year, folks were talking about how they've retitled office hours, especially as we think about, our first gen students who that means nothing to, and calling it like coffee time or, come chat with me. I mean, somebody who was like, it's, that even those subtle language changes say, I care, I'm available, I'm concerned. But I do feel for all of us. I feel was having a conversation with a colleague just earlier this week who said, normally I come off of summer and I feel like I've had the chance to take a breath and I feel rejuvenated, and I just do not feel rejuvenated at all as we're getting ready to move into yet another year that I think is going to be very emotionally demanding of us. And so we have had, last month, we did focus on staff and faculty sort of self-care. So I would encourage folks, if you didn't get to listen in on those conversations, those were some good points about how we can make sure we're also taking care of ourselves. I want to weave in, Zara's had a question about teaching and learning, and wonders if you have any recommendations for faculty where, and Zara, I feel for you because I'm hearing a lot of this. So you're teaching in an environment where perhaps the institution is still kind of involved in sort of pre-COVID protocols. We're all going to have in-person office hours, versus embracing this new vision of maybe we have some in-person office hours, but maybe those in-person office hours also involve the opportunity to hop on a Zoom call. So any thoughts or advice for Zara there?
Well, Meg, I think you actually made the perfect transition there, because our universities are so slow to adapt and respond. So the reality is a lot of us are coming back to environments that they're just reverting back to. Okay, 2 years ago, you were required to be in your office for 8 hours a week. Well, just because we are required doesn't mean that we can't take those 8 hours. And even if I have to go sit in my office, that really it's virtual opportunities to students. And it might say, yes, I'm available these hours, but here's the other hours that I can schedule that flexibly with you. And when we look at how students are communicating, and another one of the real pandemic-induced shifts, and it was a shift that was in motion. I think the pandemic just accelerated, would have taken higher ed 10 years and shoved it into 18 months. But it's the idea that it's all technology-enabled communication anyway. And so we no longer have to spend the time to say, oh, let me get an email from you and jot down that you're coming to my office hour, and let me put that on my calendar, and let me be available. We can start to do things like using tools like Calendly. And in our calendar, we can say, these are the university mandated times I will be in my office if you would like to stop by face-to-face to see me. But here's the link to my Calendly that you can just on your own set up an appointment. The Zoom will be, or Google Meets or Teams or whatever you use will be automatically integrated into that. And you can meet the university's requirement to be sitting in your office. while simultaneously meeting the student's requirement to have that all be digital and not have to reach out to you and not have to show up on campus. And so we're kind of bridging the gap. The other thing I would say is, as you're doing that, keep records. Because if faculty as a whole, and student support, because I don't think this is unique to faculty, this is also student support professionals. They would rather have virtual tutoring. They would rather have the virtual counseling. They really want that remote flexibility that they can sign up, get it, integrate it, be ready to go, all on their own. But keep track, because if we can take a year's worth of data back to our institutions and say, hey, administrators, here is what I did in my 8 hours of office hours, and here's how many students I scheduled with outside of my scheduled office hours, because my Calendly or whatever, calendar system you use gave me additional flexibility to meet with students beyond those scheduled hours. How about as an institution, we use some data and we really rethink our policies to be more student-centered and to serve them in a more effective way. And I think if sufficient faculty can show that pre-COVID policies are not effectively serving our students, I don't think universities are resistant to change. They just don't have any data or evidence to promote it.
Right. And I think I'm sure many of us can speak to being at institutions that famously, I would always say in staff meetings, it's water on a rock, right? Change is going to happen. We need to think in a timeline that is water on a rock. And I know that can be frustrating. Great question that's come in about another institution that's kind of moving back towards, well, let's go back to the way it was pre-COVID. But students are really wanting things like, it says students will only be allowed to Zoom into class by exception, only if the faculty agree to it. They've become accustomed to being able to access class, traveling for athletics, they're homesick, dealing with a family emergency, and how do we help students frustrated with these policies? And I think that speaks to data collection. Absolutely, we're documenting here are the student requests, but I think this is also, we've seen a year that this is a great time for students to really use their voices.
Right.
And as it's on the student side of the house, I think, this is an awesome opportunity to say, here are our college policies. Here is how students can lodge these kinds of requests or need through the channels that we have in our organizations. Perhaps you have some additional wise words there as far as guiding students.
Well, so I've got a little bit of a torn. I'll kind of give both. I completely agree with what you're saying about we need to make data-driven decisions. The reality is we have no idea how students are going to adapt to coming back to campus because we've never done this before. And so we should be very careful about collecting data, seeing the preferences, seeing the impact on things like retention, learning, re-enrollment, persistence, all of those things that are important. But the other thing is, if faculty are really embracing this kind of new model of teaching and learning that is much more dynamic, that's much more interactive, one has to question the value of watching that on Zoom or of watching a recording. So when we got really comfortable with, I'll just watch the recording or I'll just Zoom in, that's really based on a lecture model. And I would argue if that's all we're doing, we should absolutely let them just Zoom in and watch us. We should let them watch the recording. If that's our view of teaching, and sometimes that is the case and it's effective, so I'm not criticizing a lecture model, but if that's what we're doing, we would be hard pressed to give evidence or data that says they aren't learning just as effectively when they Zoom in and watch that lecture as opposed to watching a recording of that lecture. And so I would never advocate for policies that wouldn't allow them to Zoom in and do that if that's all we're offering. But now think about if faculty really are, and I think a lot of them are, going to embrace a much more dynamic view of teaching and learning. Flipped classroom is nothing new, but the pandemic just made millions of educators discover it for the first time. We're reinventing things that we've had for 10 years just because nobody's been motivated to look. And now what faculty are saying is, oh my gosh, I don't want to waste my time with them in class, giving them a lecture when I can record that lecture. I can make a situation where they watch it offline, take a little quiz to make sure they've watched it. And now when they come together, we're going to do action-based projects. We're going to have discussions. We're going to dive in and do something. Well, now the question becomes, is it equally effective to a student's learning to be able to zoom in and watch other people do an active learning project,
Right.
or to watch a discussion? If the answer is no, then I'm not sure we should have the flexible policies that let students access on their need. So I don't know that it's even quite a policy issue as much as it's a pedagogical issue. If students can't learn effectively because we're doing integrated, embedded, dynamic stuff in the classroom, we should figure out ways to let them know right in registration, right when they're enrolling for a class, because of the way this class is structured, flexible attendance is going to actually hurt your learning in this course. And so if we could figure out how to make those kind of rules, I think it would help address some of this flexibility, because then students that were in athletics perhaps could say, oh, that's not a great class for me to register for, because I know I have to miss. And so if I'm not going to have the same educational experience, I'm going to need to find an alternate option or take it in the spring when I'm off season or whatever that situation might be. But I think it almost goes back up to the administration level. Just like I think online classes pre-pandemic were overwhelmingly asynchronous. Well, the pandemic hit and now people are questioning, like, should we have synchronous meetings and how do we put that into our calendar and what does that look like? I actually think that's going to go away, because people who were taking online learning generally were doing it because of the scheduling issues and the challenges and the timing. And so if we're going to effectively meet that student population, adding a lot of synchronous components is not going to be beneficial. But they need to know when they register for a course, are there required synchronous times I have to be available? So we can't call it online learning and then some is asynchronous, some has required synchronous, some meets on campus, some doesn't. So I think we're going to see a shift where the registrar is going to start to have to differentiate to say, you know, this is one that's amenable to high flex. So you will be able to remote in if you can't attend in person. This is not amenable to high flex. In-person attendance is going to be a key component of this course. Or this is one that is, you know, asynchronous online, or here's asynchronous online. But I think we're going to have to differentiate to prevent the students getting really, really frustrated that they can't have the flexibility they needed when they registered for that course.
And then that also speaks to the importance of the language that we use, right? Like I think about, and you know, Jean, I mean, I teach at a community college, and so my students, I mean, asynchronous and synchronous, those are foreign, those words mean nothing. And so how are we labeling all of these different learning opportunities in a way that makes sense, that students understand? And in a pre-COVID world, I don't know if any of you experienced this. I worked in an institution that has 3 different campuses. We struggled just to get students to register to make sure that they were only going to the one campus they thought they were going to, not right. Because week 1, people would show up and be like, well, where's the 6th floor? And you're like, well, none of the buildings on this campus have 6 floors. That one is 25 minutes in that direction. Hope you have reliable transportation. So, you know, I think about how are we, I think you're so right. We do need to very clearly explain to students what is that teaching and learning experience going to be like. But we've also are so great in higher ed sometimes at coming up. There was a debate just this week on a listserv about what was hybrid learning anymore, right? Is that when I only come, sometimes I'm on campus and sometimes I'm online, or is that something different now? And
yeah, what's the difference between flipped, hybrid, blended, high flex, remote, online? Like we like to retitle and rephrase. And even if we as, you know, staff and faculty can differentiate, that's not important if the students can't. And I think, you know, going back to Kristen's kind of comment, if students are registering for courses that are not offered in a mode that matches their expectation of the flexibility they need, they are going to be incredibly frustrated. But I don't think the answer is necessarily that every faculty member should have to allow students to remote in, because if that doesn't align well with what they're doing pedagogically, we're doing them a disservice. So I think it needs addressed on a higher level, and then faculty need to actually look at their own teaching and their own courses and say, ego removed, say like, no, they could just watch this in a recording, or they could just Zoom in and they're going to get the same experience. And there are courses that are like that, particularly if you think some of the, you know, early general studies, large enrollments, you know, the intro to soc, intro to psych, they don't at many campuses tend to be super interactive because they're often large lecture courses. Well, maybe those are the ones that we can say, yep, those absolutely are high flex. You can remote in and watch it, or you can watch the recording, or you can come live. But pedagogically, it's not going to change your experience.
I'm totally off script here. Curious about flipped classrooms. I am seeing some research that's all for it, some research, you know, and I'm sure some of that has to do with how it's actually utilized or applied kind of in the classroom environment. But are you seeing that as a trend that you think is going to stick around, and any recommendations for resources? I'm thinking, you know, if we're going to go in that direction, it's more than just, oh, well, I think I'm going to have a flipped classroom, right? It does take a lot of preparation, but I think that flipped classrooms can also be applied, I think about like in group advising situations. I mean, there's in group tutoring situations, there's a lot of applicability, in my opinion, to also the work that we do in support services as well.
I think you're completely right. And the challenge whenever we say flipped classroom is it means something different to lots of different people. And I think that's why we see the research so not in agreement. Like you said, it's all over the place, from flipped classroom is the next best thing for everything to this was the worst experience ever. And I think the reason we see such variability is because there is no one size fits all teaching philosophy or pedagogical approach that fits all students, all disciplines, at all levels. And so if we think about a student that has zero background knowledge of a very complex topic, and we think we're going to just give them some readings and a video to watch outside of class, and they're going to come to class and they're going to do projects, I'm guessing our data is going to tell us the flipped classroom was a horrible idea. On the other hand, if it's something that maybe is more intuitive, it's more hands-on, it's more build up, and they're able to read it, understand it, and come into class and do something with it, I think we're going to see success. I can even think of my own classes. I teach psychology, and any of our classes that are considered like theoretical classes, so theories of personality, social psychology, students can read it, they can get it, and then when they come to me, we can do something with it and we can dive into the nuances. And it's really amenable to a flipped model. And when I use the term flipped model, I'm essentially just saying content delivery happens out of class, content application happens in class. So we're going to do something in class. And if I look at another class I teach statistics, everything from undergrad statistics to advanced doctoral statistics. If I tell them, just go read the book on multivariate analysis, and when we come in, we're just going to do the multivariate analysis, it would be a disaster. It's a horrible flipped model because the language and the way they describe stats and the background knowledge, it just isn't there. So they need me to stand in front of them, present the content, hold their hand, let them know it's okay, practice in little pieces as we go, and we need to make little bite-sized chunks. A flipped model is not great for that discipline. It's just not, because students aren't prepared. And so I think as educators, it's really more not, is flipped good, is flipped bad? The question is, can my students master the content on their own if I create a learning experience that walks them through it, lets them practice it, motivates and monitors to make sure they're doing it? Because let's face it, that's one of the biggest problems. Students understand if they'll read, they just won't read. So we need to create an environment that forces that reading via checks and balances. Maybe it's mastery quizzes. Maybe if it's a video, we have an ed puzzle that integrates and makes sure they're doing it. But then if a student has done that, will they have sufficient understanding that they can now come to class and without me re-lecturing and re-presenting it, have a discussion or do a project or dive into a case study or do something meaningful? And if your answers are yes, they could get my content if I could get them to read it, I think you're ready. And so thinking about this from the student services angle, likewise, oftentimes it might be that you are teaching them how to study. Well, is that something that they could do some of that prep work in advance? And then when they come in, you do some hands-on practice, let's do it and see how this works out. Is it something that if we can create an environment that motivates and monitors that they're doing their prep work, can we make a more meaningful hands-on experience when we have our time together?
You're inspiring me with all kinds of thoughts here, Jean. I'm taking copious notes because I can see how I'm going to use some of my resources a little differently this year. We've had a great question from Daniel about where you think the conversation needs to be taking place about staying true to your institutional type. So, you know, some of us are in institutions that are very traditional, face-to-face, and, you know, living on campus versus a blended or online virtual teaching model when you have kind of a bricks and mortar physical campus. And he put all of this in context about, you know, students returning because they've missed that campus experience and the holistic experience in person. So I'm intrigued to hear more about that. And Daniel, I appreciate you bringing that up. I don't know if anybody saw this week, the Chronicle had a really interesting piece about University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's approach to a trauma-informed return to campus. And they are doing just fascinating training of staff and orientation, a lot of examination of student, staff, and faculty experience in the last year, and recognizing that they needed to make sure when we returned, it wasn't just, all right, we're back. Right. It was, whoa, we have had this collective experience. And a lot of their faculty, staff, and student workers, they did some assessment, scored pretty high, indicating, you know, experiences PTSD, and how are we going to then acknowledge that and give space to work through some of that on our campuses. So, but the number one thing that students said in all of their research was that they really just missed the community. They desperately missed being together. So Daniel, I think that very much speaks to what you're sharing here.
Yeah, and I think, as Daniel said, campuses have an identity. And when a student chooses to go to an institution, they usually do it as a component of that identity. So they aren't registering, for example, to go to the University of Nebraska and to sit in their dorm room and take classes remotely. They're going there because they're expecting an in-person, face-to-face type experience. But that doesn't mean they aren't also expecting us to effectively use technology to make the best learning environment possible. So just because they're expecting to go face-to-face doesn't mean they're expecting to walk into a face-to-face classroom and be lectured at, because that's how the face-to-face model was. It might mean that they are looking at, wow, now I've got some flexibility that, you know, my class is only going to meet 2 days a week in person, and we have extra online options. But still, those 2 days are really integrated, hands-on, doing something in a community of learners. Likewise, those that are going to campuses that have really more of an online identity, they're not expecting to show up and have synchronous meetings 3 times a week because their schedules don't allow it. That's why they chose that institution. It also doesn't mean that we shouldn't take what we know about the value of community building and the value of synchronous and try to look at how we provide those options for those that perhaps would benefit from it. But I think we have to stay true to our identity because that's what brought them there in the first place. And the institutions are doing some really interesting things. And I'll even tell you, Grand Canyon has one. It's not a major shift, but it's an interesting shift. We always think of higher ed. You have your traditional model in which face-to-face classes are either Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday. We're just used to that. Grand Canyon went, I don't know why we have a 3-day-a-week class. Like, we obviously can do this in 2 days. We always have done them in 2 days on Tuesday, Thursday. They got rid of that. Their classes now are only Tuesday, Thursday, or frankly, for the life of me right now, I can't remember. It's either only Monday, Wednesday, or Wednesday, Friday. But that other day is no scheduled classes. And what they're doing is increasing the student support opportunities. So on that off day, they're offering enhanced tutoring opportunities. So more hours, more tutors scheduled. They're answering enhanced counseling. So they're taking that day that now has no scheduled classes and upping the extracurricular type face-to-face opportunities that students could take advantage of that particular day.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, we now don't have any 3-day-a-week scheduled classes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that, because then you really are speaking to the value of what happens in those spaces, the learning opportunities that happens. I mean, we all know how important the classroom is.
Right.
Yeah, but we get the chance to apply a lot of that learning in these extracurricular opportunities, or grow those skills that we know our workforce is looking for, right? I'm thinking like group dynamics and
right. Well, and even the student support services were telling us students want tutoring, but they're saying when we offer it, we're not available, we don't have enough. But they were struggling because when people need tutors, their tutors are busy working, like they have their own classes. And now this opened up this like, oh, we have a whole day that our tutors aren't scheduled in classes at all. We can heavy load that day and really support students effectively outside of, and have our own resources to be able to do that, because our student workers are available to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, intriguing. It's going to be interesting to see, I think, this year, how more of our institutions are going to, be addressing these kinds of support resources in really creative ways. Like how do we get, because we as we know from our conversation 2 weeks ago, students absolutely need that support in math and science and writing. So and Daniel said a great model that doesn't make additional time just on Fridays, when most folks assume a 3-day weekend. Yes. I've worked at the institutions where they're like, all right, we have our staff meetings at 3:30 on Friday.
No, and you're like, go!
Because we're all so really full of energy by 3:30 on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah, for my gut reaction is GCU's, and I should have verified this prior to the meeting, but I think it's Wednesday, Friday, so you still have your classes Friday, and then Monday is your front loaded. Like, let's start the week with energy and tutoring, and support and counseling and all of that kind of stuff. But I should verify that.
That's great. Well, we won't hold you to it, Jean. Don't worry. Well, we have just a few more minutes, and I'm afraid I've totally deviated from most of our questions, though I do feel like you've really done a beautiful job of weaving all of these into our conversation today. I guess just any kind of parting thoughts or recommendations about how our listening audience, our faculty and staff can kind of be supportive of our students and their expectations, as we kind of move into this new year.
Yeah, I'll give 2 lines, one for faculty, one for the support staff. But I think if we really think about who our students are, we have to remember that coming this fall, we have some students that haven't really truly had a campus experience since they were in high school. And those students might be juniors. So we're talking 2 years of a non-traditional, not what we would normally think. And so I don't know that anybody knows exactly what our expectations are, which means we need to be much more explicit and clear and increase our communication. Because as faculty, if we are going to revert to all of our unwritten, unspecified expectations we had pre-COVID, students don't even know what those were. They haven't been in college. They haven't experienced it. They haven't gone through the traditional freshman orientation. So it's going to be completely foreign to them. It was always foreign, but we had these freshman orientations that we'd kind of like gear them up. Well, we don't have junior orientations, but really they're coming in with the same 0 expectations that they would have had, 2 years ago. And so I think if we can really start to be more clear about those expectations, whether that's our policies for class, our policies for attendance, how we're going to structure office hours, what we expect in terms of timeliness, the use of the learning management system, all of those things. And then increase communication so that we're actually getting those things to our students. I mean, oftentimes as faculty, we're like, it's in the syllabus. I put it in the syllabus. And then we make memes about how students don't read the syllabus. And then we complain that they don't understand our policies that we put in our syllabus. We know they don't read the syllabus. Why are we complaining that they don't know what we put in there?
Mm-hmm.
But if we can start doing things like making a fluid syllabus, something they're more likely to utilize, looking at how we can use push technology to actually get that into their text or somewhere beyond email, because we know they're not looking at email. So we're emailing them and then complaining that they don't get the emails.
Mm-hmm.
All the data tells us they're not using that. Most of the data now says they're app-driven communication, that they want to have a system like Remind or Slack or Yellow Dig or something like that, that they can glance at their phone, know that there's some communications from that particular school or class sitting there, and they can look at them when they need them. We need to really think about how do we communicate with students in a way they're going to get the communication, and then how are we more explicit about our expectations in those communications.
Awesome. Awesome. Jean, I'm writing notes frantically because this is so important. And absolutely, and communication has come up in every single podcast we have done in the last year. Just that more than ever, it is absolutely critical that we are very clearly communicating expectations to students, and doing so using the resources, right? It's not enough just to email it, because they're not going to read that.
Right.
So.
Last time I glanced at my son's phone, he had like 3,000 unread emails. And I'm like, oh, and he's like, why? Should I be checking that all the time? And he's going to be a high school senior. I'm like, oh my gosh. And yet he absolutely has his communication apps that his football coach uses and his basketball coach. And he's on it because he sees the little app button. He checks his messages. It's just email isn't his mode. And we can keep complaining students don't check their email, but perhaps the solution is not forcing them to check the email and us adapting our communications into a way they do check.
Right, right. And Jean, that's a really beautiful transition point for the conversation that we're going to have in 2 weeks, when I've got 6 students from community college, from 4-year institutions, large and small, public and private, who are going to come and talk to us about kind of their expectations, their anxieties for the fall semester. And it'll be a good time to ask them how, well, that'll be a good question. How would you like to receive communication? What are the communication tools that are the best ones that your institution is using, and what are the ways that the messages just aren't getting to you? So I'll have to make sure we hit on that. Jean, I want to thank you so much for your time this month. You have just brought such important perspective to conversation about how are we going to really support our students moving into this fall semester, this year of kind of great uncertainty. Yeah, and I would remind everyone, take care of yourselves too. Yes, because we can only take care of our students when we have taken care of ourselves. So I hope everyone has time this weekend to do something that is restful and renewing, even if it's poor Jean trying to figure out how you pack 2 chairs, a mini fridge, and a microwave in a VW Bug to drive to Grand Canyon University. So
everyone, yes. Wish me luck. Yeah.
We absolutely do, Gina. We cannot wait to see pictures. So, so thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everyone, to our listening audience. Just as a reminder, for those of you who are GoTo Knowledge members, this will be available to you on your dashboard. For anyone, if you want to share this, or I know some folks were not able to join us right at the stroke of 12 Eastern, always our podcast is available on whatever podcasting channel makes your heart happy. So feel free to go out. I think it pairs well nicely with a lovely walk or your beverage of choice, personally. So maybe that can be part of your rest and renewal for this week. Jean, thank you. Take care. Best of luck with the remaining days or weeks of summer that you have. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Meg.
Take care.